Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Van Bibber's Leap. It says, just below the falls of Kanawha in West Virginia, there is a lofty and overhanging rock of immense size, which to this day goes by the name of Van Bibber's Rock, and the incident which thus designated it is one of the wildest and most exciting to be found in the records of backwoods adventure. The rock juts out about 100 feet over the seething, dangerous whirlpool at the foot of the falls and nearly 150 feet above the surface of the water. The surroundings in the immediate neighborhood of the rock are wild and picturesque in the extreme, but the opposite shore is comparatively level and smiling, with a charming interspersion of pastures, meadows, and timber, a gently shelving beach of sand sloping gradually out into the boiling waters, which continue their disturbed and riotous character for many rods below. Hiram Van Bibber, an enterprising backwoodsman from the eastern part of Virginia, was the first to build a cabin upon this inviting bank of the Kanawha in the latter part of the last century. Having had much experience and being a bold and independent character, he lost no time in bringing his young wife and 2 children to the new home that he had provided for them. Notwithstanding that the region round about swarmed with hostile or semi-hostile Indians, he was unmolested for a year or more, and the land was so fertile that it was not long before he had a number of neighbors, almost as hardy, adventurous, and hard-working as himself. Indeed, a regular little settlement sprang up, which, with Van Bibber at its head, presented quite a village-like appearance at the end of the second year, the settlers building their cabins pretty close together as a mutual protection against the Indians. Then, about this time, a small government supply station was established a few miles further down the stream, which added greatly to the general sense of security and repose. But this state of affairs existed almost exclusively upon the fertile or low-lying side of the river, while the wild and rocky region, including the opposite bank, continued to be occupied by roving bands of red hunters, who, if not actually hostile, often cast regards of sullen discontent and jealousy upon that fair portion of their ancient heritage, which the industry and enterprise of the pale-faced intruders were swiftly causing to blossom like the rose. It was as though civilization and savagery directly confronted each other, with the boiling river as the only debatable ground between, and the great frowning, overhanging rock looking far away as a black standing menace on the part of the rude tribes, whose wigwams and hunting lodges still clung with the tenacity of despair amid the glens and thickets thereabouts. Captain Van Bibber was the soul and heart of the little settlement. His renown as a hunter and Indian fighter was only equaled by his reputation for fair dealing and worldly prudence, and from the first, he was looked upon by his neighbors as their natural leader. No axe more rapidly thinned the forest ranks than his, no rifle was sure, no canoe more dauntlessly breasted the perilous waters of the mountain-cradled, gorge-nursed, cataract-fretted stream. Another child was born to him in the bosom of the wilderness. His wife was happy and contented, and his cabin home was the abode of frugal thrift and hard-earned repose. The only other member of his household, besides his wife and 3 children, was a great pet bear called Brownie, which he had captured when a cub, and tamed with such wisdom and thoroughness that it was accustomed to follow him, unmuzzled, among the cabins like a dog, and with no inclination to rejoin its kind among the neighboring hills. Indeed, the brute displayed an exceptional affection for him and his family. The officers and soldiers of the little fort often came to witness its tricks and pranks, and Van Bibber and his bear was the expression most generally used by outsiders in alluding to our hero. Trouble with the Indians arose, which at last, so far as one tribe was concerned, the Shawnees, broke into open war. The authorities were constantly on the alert, and it became a hazardous experiment for any settler to proceed alone through the rocky and thickly timbered region on the unfriendly side of the river. This, however, did not prevent Captain Van Bibber from setting out upon a lonely hunting expedition amid its dangers upon a certain April day that was destined to be memorable in the annals of the settlement, and at the time to give his name to the giant rock, which had theretofore been exclusively known by its Indian name, Wakangete, signifying the faraway lookout. A great freshet had so flushed the falls of the Kanawha that he did not venture to cross the river at the point directly below the rapids and just between the settlement and the Grey Rock. He passed down the stream for a mile or more to a lonely cabin occupied by a hunter named Radcliffe, where he borrowed a canoe, effected a crossing, and fearlessly plunged into the heart of the enemy country. He had undertaken this expedition against the advice of his friends and even the entreaties of his wife. The winter had been a hard one. There was a shortness of supplies in his humble larder, and game was uncommonly scarce on his own side of the river. These considerations were sufficient to impel him upon his dangerous errand, in spite of all the warnings and forecasts of misadventure that were held forth to deter him. He had capital sport and shot a number of deer and wild turkeys, carcasses of which he secreted to await a conveyance to his home, when the subsiding waters of the river and other favoring circumstances should enable him to make another trip on horseback for that purpose, and accompanied by his associates. It was toward the middle of the afternoon when he started to return home, from which he found himself about 8 miles distant. Up to this time, he had not encountered a single red man, or even any signs of their being in his vicinity. But he had no sooner quitted the belt of timber in which he had been hunting, and began to make his way across the broad, rolling, and somewhat broken plateau that lay between him and the precipitous river bank, than a shot from a concealed foe whistled through his squirrel-skin cap. He at once crouched close to the ground and prepared for fighting. But another and yet another shot followed the first in swift succession, and upon peeping up from his semi-covert, he was astonished at perceiving a score or mere of savages cautiously but rapidly approaching his position from different points of the forest. He was astonished but not alarmed, though he at once knew them to be hostile Shawnees from the peculiarity of their scanty costumes, and therefore understood that nothing but his scalp would satisfy their murderous intentions. They had him almost surrounded, and there was nothing to do but to run for it. So after bringing down the foremost by a well-directed shot, Van Bibber suddenly sprang to his feet and sped over the open plain like a hunted stag, escaping the numerous shots that were sent after him as if by a miracle, and with the entire band in yelling and bloodthirsty pursuit. Van Bibber, who was a famous runner, however, was under no apprehension of being overtaken by his enemies, swift of foot as they undoubtedly were. It may here be observed, in passing, that it's a common mistake to suppose that the Indian has, as a rule, ever been able to surpass the white hunter in woodcraft, natural cunning, or any of the athletic exercises belonging to his own savage condition and training. It needs but to recall the examples of Boone, Kenton, Brady, the Weitzel brothers, and many others too numerous to mention, to prove the contrary. Upon anything like an even footing, Caucasian intelligence, allied with Caucasian strength and daring, has ever proved the red man's superior, even upon his native heath, and among its chosen and hereditary employments. Captain Van Bibber had long been noted as the strongest, fleetest, and most formidable hunter of the Kanawha Valley. Nobly did he vindicate his reputation on that eventful day. He not only acquitted himself so creditably as to keep beyond the range of the poor rifles with which his pursuers were armed, but was also enabled to load and fire as he ran, thus causing several of them to bite the dust before they finally drove him to bay out upon the furthermost point of Wakungita, the great jutting rock overlooking the terrible whirlpool at the foot of the falls, and his humble but smiling home on the far opposite bank. Yes, the Indians, though unable to overtake their fugitive, had nevertheless succeeded in baffling all his attempts to reach the river at the point which he had effected a crossing in the morning. They had so managed to dictate the direction of his flight as to bring him at last to a final and apparently hopeless stand upon the very edge of this tremendous abyss, with obviously no choice left him but surrender or death at their hands, or an equally fatal plunge into the boiling cauldron-like whirlpool far, far below. But even in this desperate strait, Van Bibber did not lose a jot of his cool and collected daring. Ensconcing himself behind a small group of stones and bushes, and loading and discharging his trusty rifle with wonderful rapidity, he succeeded in keeping the enemy at bay for more than a quarter of an hour, in full view of his wife and friends on the opposite bank of the river, while the Indians, though not venturing out upon the open shelf, within range of his terrible marksmanship, clustered along its bushy sides, and even crept down far below, in the very face of the cliff, yelling like demons, in the certainty of his speedy capture or death, and seeking every opportunity to pick him off from behind his little fastness in which he had temporarily entrenched himself. That it was only temporarily soon became evident. Captain Van Bibber suddenly ceased firing, and for the first time, a feeling of despair must have come over him. He had used the last bullet in his pouch, and was no longer capable of defense. The Indians soon suspected as much, and began to swarm over the top of the rock, in full view, and with revengeful cries. But at this instant, when he was about giving himself up for lost, a clear, encouraging cry came floating to him from far across the yawning abyss, and making itself distinctly heard above the roaring of the waters. It was a woman's voice, his wife's. "I'm coming under the rock in the canoe," she cried. "Leap and meet me." He turned and looked in the direction from which the summons had come, dazed and bewildered, for such a leap had never been made, nor even contemplated before. But the heroic woman was already in the canoe, paddle in hand, having laid her baby on the grassy bank, and rushed to the rescue, in spite of the opposition of her neighbors, who looked upon her husband as already doomed beyond redemption, and regarded her attempt to navigate the boiling waters of the whirlpool as simple madness. But she pushed off, and just as she did so, Brownie, the pet bear, clambered into the stern of the canoe and sat upright upon his haunches, keeping his balance perfectly, and in reality, aiding not a little in trimming boat and ballasting it, as it were, throughout the wild voyage. As Mrs. Van Bibber succeeded in reaching the center of the stream, directly under the ledge of the rock, her husband's foes were almost upon him. "Wife, wife," he shouted, "drop down a little lower, I'm coming." With this, and with the clutches of the Indians almost closing upon him, he sprang from the crag, and descended like a plummet into the water, feet foremost. In an agony of suspense, the wife rested from her toil a moment, watching for him to rise to the surface, the canoe bobbing about like a cockleshell upon the angry flood, and the pet bear eyeing his mistress affectionately, as though fully sympathizing with her distress. It was only a moment, but an awful one. It seemed an age to her. Would her husband ever rise? Her earnest gaze seemed to penetrate the very depths of the turbid water, and then, with a joyous, thankful cry, she darted the canoe further down the stream. He rose to the surface quite near to her, and was enabled to scramble into the little craft without assistance, and amid a shower of bullets that was poured after him by the baffled redskins, not one of which, however, harmed either him or his wife. Then, seizing the paddle from her hands, he swung the craft around, turning Brownie's back to the hostile bank, and paddled swiftly out of range of the shots that were still showered after him. But it's more than likely that poor Bruin had much to do with the immunity with which his master and mistress were permitted to draw out of range. At any rate, when Van Bibber and his wife reached the shore, and were assisted to land by their rejoicing friends, Brownie remained seated motionless in the stern of the canoe, with his tongue hanging out and his eyes closed, and he was found to be stark dead, with his back fairly riddled with bullets, more than one of which must inevitably have reached the human occupants, but for the chance bulwark that had been presented by his tough and shaggy frame. Captain Van Bibber had experienced a greater shock from his terrific leap than had been supposed, and he staggered like a drunken man as his wife led him to the grassy spot upon which she had deposited her babe upon rushing to his rescue, and where it was still lying, crowing and laughing at a great rate, and he then fainted away. He soon recovered, however, and he and his wife lived to a green old age, with their family around them, many of their descendants still surviving them in the same fertile valley, and within the very shadow of the great overhanging shelf which has ever since borne their name, in deserving commemoration of Van Bibber's leap. This story came from the great state of Wisconsin, being reported in the Manitowoc Pilot of October 28, 1880. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.